Just Cause is a series of third-person action-adventure titles developed by Avalanche Studios. With 4 main releases, the franchise is notable for drastically upping the scale of open-world environments and the ways you can traverse them. It's been through both peaks and catacombs in its quest for free-roaming supremacy. How did the focus on size progress, and how does the core action hold up? Let's get this thrill ride started. In the progression of gaming tech, there has always been a demand to go bigger and better. The open world genre is no stranger to this. When Rockstar's Grand Theft Auto 3 revolutionized the landscape in 2001, many developers quickly jumped on its rendition of a larger city environment. Being able to go anywhere and commandeer any vehicle at any time played a key role in crafting living, breathing worlds. Enter Avalanche Studios, a Swedish company looking to prove themselves in this new frontier of 3D action. Their first game would involve a battle to liberate an exotic island from the clutches of its totalitarian government. I recall reading about Just Cause back in 2006 with a review by the UK magazine Games Master. At the time it looked pretty cool, but I was too young to play it. Some 15 years later, I've finally gotten into it for the first time. The original Just Cause stands as an ambitious release that's highly constrained by the technology of the time. It had a lot of extravagant ideas, but also a fair few snags in how it implemented them. Revolutionary fervor and guerrilla warfare run through the veins of the Just Cause series. These themes share some ties with real-world events, like Latin American efforts to achieve independence. You play as Rico Rodriguez, a secret agent cross between Xander Cage from the XXX series and the mariachi of Desperado. Calm and cool, this one-man army is out to liberate the nation of San Espirito with his handlers Tom Sheldon and Maria Kane as backup. Between Sheldon's chain-smoking gravel and Kane's smart aleck remarks, the game provides a light dose of personality. That's pretty much the extent of the story and all the depth I have to go on for most of the series. With an organisation as generic as The Agency, Just Cause has never been about cinematic storytelling. As controversial as interventionism and foreign meddling is in today's world, it's treated as something frivolous here. If the game took itself completely seriously, Rico would probably be going around pondering over whether he's the real terrorist in this situation. For the first game in its series, the developers did keep things relatively restrained, adopting a tinge of grounded action. The game gets started quickly with the protagonist skydiving onto the island and heading straight into battle with the forces of President Salvador Mendoza. Straight away, the game's primary selling points are put on display, and in the early going, Rico hooks up with the rebel forces and begins his campaign to rip apart a regime at its foundations. You have the run of the place from the offset. At 1,025 square kilometers, the province of San Espirito was one of the biggest game worlds ever produced at the time. It was even bigger than Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, which clocked in at 38.2 square kilometers. Extreme sports have always been a huge spectacle, often used in YouTube montages, but also confined to those with the right skills and attitude to take on the risky challenge. Just Cause's use of these platforming mechanics set it apart from other open-world efforts. Most characters in open worlds were limited to sprinting, light climbing, and swimming. By contrast, Rico can skydive, base jump, paraglide, and leap between moving vehicles. This ludicrous action is reminiscent of films like Point Break and the many efforts of Jackie Chan. Watching the protagonist cling to the tail fin of an aircraft as it flies through the air was a sight you couldn't find in other releases, and the way these moves are always available encourages the player to make use of them. The map itself is dotted with a ton of side content, mostly involving 2 rebel factions, the People's Liberation Army of San Espirito and their supporting drug cartel Rioja. Aside from short, rendered cutscenes that bookend missions, you'll rarely see any kind of development. They're merely placeholders to the main action, and they serve that role well enough. While both offer Rico a place in their ranks and seek the overthrowing of Mendoza's forces, the jobs they have for him are standard fare. There's province liberations, in which you destroy government barricades and take out the soldiers guarding them, simple fetch quests involving item pickups, and finally scavenger hunts. While all are quite samey, the latter is easily the weakest of the bunch, as you're simply running around the environments until you find all 10, or in other cases 15 collectibles. This early round of busy work on a construction site didn't leave the best impression. Rico really needed a sprint button to speed these along. As you complete tasks, the faction control over each sector of the country expands, indicated by the red and green sections of the political map. While the menus lack detail, they still serve their purpose, letting you know where Rico is in the environment and the player's overall progression throughout the campaign. It takes the form of a PDA, connecting Rodriguez with the agency and allowing him to access their various services. In another first for the genre, the player can call down a vehicle at just about any time. Whether it's a motorbike or armoured car, you're able to summon a quick route around the island very easily. Navigation is also well defined by the objective markers. By having red, green and yellow arrows extending into the sky, the player can easily find their way and know what kind of mission they're getting into. Putting aside the achievements of map design, how does the core gameplay fare? It's competent, if a little unwieldy. The shooting is handled through an incredibly generous auto-targeting system, allowing the player to spray and pray through the entire game. As long as you can see a white reticule with flashes of red, the enemies will go down without much trouble. It's only when their numbers start stacking up that the challenge starts to mount. Even so, if you lay on the bullets and keep an eye out for health kits, you'll easily prevail. Rico's twin revolvers never run dry, and even later in the game they're a viable option for dealing with foes who don't change all that much outside of carrying more deadly firearms. If there's one gap in the weapon list, it's that snipers and shotguns aren't as effective as running and gunning. At long or close range, the enemies take longer to kill or get the protagonist to stop in his tracks. Oftentimes it's not the soldiers who are your greatest foes, but the terrain itself. This brings me to the weakest part of the package, the driving. Getting the physics and overall feel of cars right has been a consistent dilemma, not just in open world titles, but gaming in general. If their handling is too loose or too precise, a lot of frustration is sure to ensue. Cars in Just Cause are slippery and very sloppy in their design, easily veering off course, bouncing off objects, and having a lot of trouble going off-road. The hills themselves are a major obstacle, as trying to take shortcuts will often result in players getting stuck. When the game's features do break over themselves, it's often during the main missions. One early objective sees you tailing a government official to a secret volcano resort. As soon as you enter combat, he starts to escape, and Rico has to keep within a close distance. Unfortunately, there are no vehicles to be found in this camp, meaning I had to call down a vehicle in advance and then follow him up the mountain. A move that wasn't always granted by the agency due to uneven ground or being in the middle of a fight. Another annoying moment happens here, where you have to take down one of Salvador's generals on his way to a meeting. Trying to ram him off the road is very finicky, and your vehicle will often get destroyed by enemy fire, costing precious time as you try to find another one. Ultimately, it's the limitations in the gameplay that drag the early missions down. You can only jump to another car if you're right alongside it, and you can't shoot while driving unless the vehicle is equipped with its own armament. This can make missions like this one a massive pain. Transporting supplies to a rebel base without losing too many crates, alongside enemies constantly firing at you, makes for a tedious slog. Despite the variety of things to do and the large landscape to traverse, Just Cause is also plagued by many design inconsistencies. Its activities and objectives don't coalesce into a satisfying whole. Side activities can often give you points with factions and gradually improve rebel control over each district, but neither of these are really worth the effort. Sure, you can unlock additional weapons, a safe house here and there, and even the occasional vehicle, yet all of these unlockables are unneeded as the game goes on. Because you can call in an equipment drop from the agency at any time, or grab stronger weapons off of enemies or safe houses, you'll always be well equipped. Rico can even call for a helicopter extraction that takes you straight to the next mission's start point, effectively negating the unique traversal in the franchise's debut. The same holds true for other tools. The game has a grappling hook for additional stunt work, but I never used it once in my entire playthrough. Not only are there very few instances where you need it, it's also very impractical, leaving Rico a sitting duck in mid-air. Instead of grappling up to enemy choppers, I simply locked on with the rocket launcher and took them down. In hindsight, it seems Avalanche couldn't get the balance right between traversal and player convenience. This awkward balance between those who want to explore and those who just want to blast their way through the story is often at odds with the game's more memorable features. What the developer needed to do was incorporate all of these elements in a more cohesive manner. For example, boosting the rebels' control over an area or achieving a specific faction rank could have been a prerequisite to unlocking more story missions. In turn, this would have directed players towards the side content and pushed for more completion. As it stands, you can blast through Just Cause in about 3 to 4 hours. If you're a completionist, this timescale goes up a fair bit. There isn't much to unlock at the end either. You're free to explore the world and complete any side jobs you missed, but for such a massive landscape, it's a shame there aren't other ways to mess around when you're done with the story. In other missions, the problem is reversed. When Rico is confined to on-foot gameplay, things once again become very sluggish. Having to scale oil towers to rig an explosion, or venturing into a prison to rescue a captured guerrilla fighter, don't leverage the game's strengths. Instead, they default to most other open-world games at the time, where you run into a location and kill everyone on sight. Luckily, as the game goes on, both the agency and the rebels start to command more influence. In turn, this generates more extravagant scenarios. Hopping in a heavily armed chopper and bombing a train carrying nuclear weapon parts is highly enjoyable. You'll also unlock an agency helicopter, making it much easier to gather up trinkets and complete side missions. In one liberation mission, I was able to take the aforementioned attack helicopter into battle, which made the enemies a complete joke in their defense. Ironically, whenever Rico isn't running or driving on the ground, Just Cause is far more enjoyable. The controls don't get in your way, and you don't have to worry about enemies taking out your vehicle nearly as much. With that said, you'll sometimes die not having a clue what hit you. The only indication of damage in air vehicles is the colour change when they're about to explode. The size of the environment does come at a cost, and that's the graphical presentation. On PC, the issues are non-existent, but on PlayStation 2 and other older consoles, Just Cause looks incredibly dated, with slowdown happening on a frequent basis. The footage you've been watching speaks for itself. The game isn't a looker. Aside from a well-presented day and night cycle, this supposedly lush and tropical island is an unremarkable backdrop to the proceedings. Buildings, most notably these ones in the city, look especially undetailed, with very basic patterns for both civilians and traffic. The brief cutscenes are passable for the time, but they do feature some disjointed transitions. On an audio level, things fare a bit better, but the continuous use of Spanish guitars and other more traditional instruments can wear thin. The soundtrack kicks into a higher gear whenever Rico starts blasting, and while it does match the setting, you'll have had your fill by the halfway mark. As you'd expect, Just Cause's climax involves Mendoza losing control of his kingdom and retreating. Even by 6th generation standards, this finale is basic and more than a little rushed. It's very indicative of the game's limitations, as Rico chases Mendoza back to his private island. The rebels he's been helping the entire game sit this one out. As you fight your way to the presidential palace, your task is fairly straightforward. Even the addition of Black Hand ninjas don't change up the gameplay all that much. You'll make your way to the centre of the island, only to make your way back in the opposite direction in a fighter jet. Saving the fastest vehicle for last is a fitting payoff, as you destroy Mendoza's missiles mid-flight. You then transition to the dictator's private jet. The grand finale is essentially a glorified QuickTime event. Wait for the plant explosive prompt to appear during the skydive, and that's the end of the game. Despite the many issues that hold it back from greatness, Just Cause was still successful. Many players looked past its flaws and saw a lot of potential in its explosive tone. Thanks to sales over 1 million strong, it would extend into a franchise with a sequel arriving 4 years later. I think we can all agree it was a substantial improvement. With greater hardware power, Avalanche was able to scale up further. When they set out to make Just Cause 2, they looked to address the first game's faults as well as they could. This was my entry point into the series, as I kept up with the many developer diaries that discussed gameplay features. I was immediately sold after playing the demo, and quickly purchased the full release. Just Cause 2 would become the highest selling and most popular entry in the series. How did it do this? By focusing on fun above all else. The game arrived right in the middle of the 7th generation, and was made at a time before checklisting and bloated content pools began to saturate the genre. Playing Just Cause 2 after the first highlights how much progress the series made when moving to 7th gen hardware. Almost every fault I had with the original was addressed and then some. On top of all that, Just Cause 2 was even graced with a multiplayer mode designed by modders for the PC. That's the true staying power of the title. To this day, it remains arguably the best game Avalanche has ever put out, and this comes down to two massive upgrades in both design and gameplay. This time, it's all about the nation of Panau, a South Asian country led by President Panay, derogatively known as Baby P. Having deposed his father and cut all ties with the US, the agency decides to take him out. Being an Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 release, the increased use of cutscenes is apparent, with some crappy facial animations to boot. Once again, these serve a basic setup, and you can easily skip over them if need be. With that said, their placement can feel rather arbitrary, especially when paired up with several loading screens in a row. Take the Stronghold Liberation missions for example. You go to the mission start point, then wait for a loading screen. We see Rico talk to a crime boss in their hideout, another loading screen. You get into a chopper with the faction leader and ride to the destination, one more loading screen. Rico hops out with the rebel forces, and you wait for yet another loading screen. While reusing these cinematics must have cut down on development duties, the pacing is sometimes slowed in these sections. Despite this flaw, the majority of your in-game hours are still spent exploring the gargantuan landscape. At approximately 1,000 square kilometers, Just Cause 2 dwarfed just about every other open world released in 2010. Increasing the scale is one thing, but having a diverse set of environments is equally important, and the game delivers this in spades. The locales include the capital city to the northwest, desert to the southwest, marshes and woodland along the southeast, and mountain peaks to the northeast. In between all of these are dozens of smaller civilian settlements that aren't necessarily combat targets, but do contain lots of collectibles to pick up. No matter where you are, any acts of violence will trigger a quick response from the authorities, which scale up on 5 levels of heat. They're much better equipped as well, with helicopters, paratrooper squads, SAM turrets to counter your own vehicles, and backup units arriving by road. As a result, they can drop your health much more quickly, so you'll have to get used to finding health packs when the screen starts flashing red, a frequent occurrence throughout the title. Not that you'll care about the story tying it together. Just Cause 2 stays the course with another ludicrous narrative. Early on, Rico hooks up with 3 criminal factions, all vying for control of the province. The Roaches are essentially Panau's local mafia, dressed in fancy suits with missions that focus on corrupt business and the commercial side of things. In the middle, we have the Reapers, a more traditional group of rally-the-people revolutionaries in the style of Cuban leaders. Their missions are a mixture of subterfuge and sabotage. The third faction, the Ular Boys, are a pack of spiritual environmentalists who also provide the more extravagant sequences in the game. What all 3 of them lack is a sense of interplay. One side mission sees you kidnap a Roach informant on behalf of the Reapers, and yet Razak Razman, yes that's actually his name, is none the wiser, still offering jobs for Rico to undertake. It's a bit of a missed opportunity, especially when you take the ending into account. A tug of war between the 3 factions could have added another layer to the open world. As it stands, they're relegated to mini cutscenes that also repeat. Razman sits in his truck, Santosi hangs off the back of a van, and Irawan lounges around in the back seat. The side missions can be generic at times. Assassinate this person, blow up this base, steal a vehicle, typical stuff. But when the objectives do get switched up, they utilise the game's mechanics really well. Come Fly With Me is an aerial assault on Baby P's space program, but with the twist of stealing a jet and destroying the final satellite before it breaks orbit. On the other hand, Stranded delivers a more atmospheric tone as you journey to a foreboding island that brings the Bermuda Triangle to mind. The combination of driving supplies to safety and dismantling a giant EMP tower makes for a big highlight. The main missions are quite good for the most part. Their main strength is how they transfer between on-foot and vehicle-based gameplay more effectively. One of the first moments sees Rico scaling a casino to rescue a drunken informant, followed up by a chase along the main road. By the third mission in the game, the nugget of Tom Sheldon going rogue is immediately tossed out the window as the game goes for pure silliness. Rico's close companion fires off some zingers as you tear up an ancient temple with a minigun. The over-the-top action keeps on building in the missions to come. One sees you rescuing the local spy Jade Tan from an ice-field fortress. Moving from attacking the base to chasing down a convoy across the ice is very enjoyable, not to mention open to interpretation. You could hijack each car in turn, or plant C4 on the roof to take them out, for example. The Three Kings mission isn't as good, with 3 boss fights that rely heavily on insta-kill explosives. Chinese, Russian and Japanese warlords stand atop the 3 towers, with each fight being tougher than the last. It's the only mission that skirts close to on-foot limitations, confining you to smaller rooftops. Through it all, the game never loses sight of its wacky tone. When listening to lines like these, you know the developer wanted Just Cause 2 to be a fun, goofy time above all else.
This is Radio Panau, the voice of truth, so listen to it.
That'll teach you! That'll teach you!
A sloth demon, baby. Come on, Rico.
Okay, but if you mess with me, I will kill you.
It's a B-movie, with intentionally hokey lines and wonky accents from everyone involved. Even with all these varied missions, Just Cause 2 isn't remembered for the main campaign. Off-mission is where the game truly shines. One of my biggest critiques of the first Just Cause was how disconnected its components were, the way the activities didn't contribute to your progress or feed into each other. In the sequel, it all boils down to a single currency, chaos, which forms the backbone of the entire experience and how you engage with the world. Committing acts of sabotage, completing missions, winning races and finding items, all of these activities contribute to your chaos total. In turn, this fuels 4 unlock bars that are constantly on display: main missions, stronghold takeovers, faction objectives, and agency unlocks. In this way, nearly everything you do in the game world is contributing to something, which compels the player to engage and keep at it until they reach the end of the title. This formula is tight as a drum and directs you straight towards the best gameplay features on offer. That's what you call great game design, and with a total of 368 locations to be discovered, there's thousands of opportunities to cause mayhem. Collectibles for the free gangs are also here, but this time they flow organically with the player's own exploration, rather than confining them to a small section. A small Wi-Fi signal and minimap in the top left corner inform you of how close you are without giving away the exact location. Completing Just Cause 2 is no small task, but the game tracks your progress every step of the way with pop-ups at the top of the screen. In turn, this cuts down on the time you spend flicking through menus. Even more impressive was how the gameplay sandbox grew and expanded. As early as the first mission, there's a huge range of ways to take on the mountain base. Guns and explosives are both viable, but there's one option that makes a bigger impression: the grappling hook. It serves your main source of platforming and a deadly weapon in battle as you slingshot your way around the map with unlimited use and a complete disregard for the laws of physics. With this set of items at your disposal, the ways to blow shit up have grown exponentially. You can shoot at items until they collapse, use explosives to take out multiple targets at once, rip off a Gatling gun to mow down your enemies, set off explosive barrels to cause a chain reaction, hijack an enemy vehicle to wreak havoc, attach them to the side of bridges with the dual hook to tip them over the edge, and even attach one vehicle to another and use it as a wrecking ball. Even the destruction targets themselves form their own mini-scenarios. You can overload pipelines with a basic sequence of buttons, or dive to the bottom of an oil well, overload it, and zip your way out before it blows. These kinds of in-game events are optimized for maximum thrills, and you'll have a blast every time you come across them. Truly, Panau is a place where you can endlessly toy with both enemies and the environment. By swapping between all these options, the gameplay remains engaging for the most part, and the returning heavy drops are on hand once again to further broaden your approach. This goes hand in hand with a cache and upgrade system that aims to balance out the proceedings. Collecting over 2,000 crates strewn about the environments will make your equipment more effective. It seems the unlimited vehicle deliveries really drained the agency's budget, as this time around you've got to pay for your arsenal. This serves as further encouragement to get into the game's activities, as you're also rewarded with money whenever you complete one of the many tasks. Rico does start off relatively weak with basic pistols and assault rifles, But because every kind of destruction adds to your resources, you'll proceed through the unlocks at a reasonable pace. The only drawback is how weapon pickups from enemies are locked to upgrade level 1 until you unlock them for purchase. This can cause an unfair difficulty spike in some missions. This objective for the Ular boys has you defend a satellite dish from enemy choppers, providing you with a rocket launcher to take them out. But because I was using the weakest version of the weapon, it was ridiculously hard to mount a strong defense. With over 100 unique vehicles, the ways to get around have been upgraded too. The game casts off any semblance of realism its predecessor had, and opts for an exaggerated physics system. Vehicles flip, spin and crash far more easily, particularly on more uneven terrain. On the one hand, driving feels a lot better than it did in the first title, with more responsive controls and a larger variety of them to commandeer. Races, with a few exceptions, are now more enjoyable, and moreover they're actually worth doing here as they reward you with further cash to continue your rampages. The many high-speed chases you'll get into maintain a great sense of forward momentum. Equally beneficial was how the game loosened the game over conditions. Something as simple as having helicopters crash to the ground rather than killing Rico instantly brings another set of thrilling moments where you dodge death by the skin of your teeth. With the right amount of practice, you can chain multiple hijackings and bursts of firepower into a spectacular display of carnage. If all else fails, you can use the protagonist's endlessly reusable parachute along with the grappling hook to quickly zip away from danger. This will often be your preferred mode of transport, as Rico can tug himself along beaches and even haul his way up to higher altitudes. All of these elements combine to form a fun factor that's become very rare in open world games today. As opposed to busy work, I was eager to jump back into the loop, blow up a few more settlements, then escape in a vehicle and do it all over again. If in doubt, giving the player ways to mess around in the world just for the hell of it can make your game stand out. They don't always have to be chasing collectibles or completing missions. As a result, Just Cause 2 had many videos uploaded that homed in on bloopers, glitches and silly stuff. This often involved the grappling hook being used to connect various objects and vehicles together with wacky results. Players who wanted to share some of these moments for themselves could do so with a PS3 exclusive video editor which uploaded content directly to YouTube. Back in the day, I posted a few videos myself. Hard to believe it's been more than a decade since I first got into the platform. You can find these at a link in the description. The game also featured some DLC items, from the Bullseye assault rifle to the Agency hovercraft. I would have included some of these downloads in the video, but I ran into a glitch that caused the game to get stuck on the black market screen. It seems that trying to install these items over 10 years later can cause problems, at least for the PlayStation 3 version. I had another problem early on where the game's assets refused to load, prompting a restart. As much as I've gushed about how entertaining Just Cause 2 is, there's no doubt that it does have issues, and they rear their heads when you need to be precise. For starters, the auto-targeting has been loosened a fair bit to alter the overall challenge. Your bullets will generally hit who you're aiming at, but targeting vulnerable spots like the heads of Panau colonels can make for some annoying moments. The same is also true for the grappling hook, as you'll often latch onto the wrong anchor points or leave Rico dangling awkwardly with no way of clambering up. Flying vehicles can also prove a bit troublesome. Because planes and fighter jets are difficult to keep straight in the air, your rockets will often miss their target, and I found myself careening off course or smashing straight into an abrupt death. It's ironic that for all your high-flying power, Rico is more at risk of crashing and burning than he is from enemy projectiles. Item delivery missions also make a return, and they once again become problematic when the game's physics decide to deliver a suboptimal outcome. With no means of manually flipping vehicles or grabbing lost items, this will often trigger many fail states, making some moments more based on luck rather than skill. Another area of improvement was the overall presentation. While I mentioned before the cutscenes were fairly weak and repetitive, the island of Panau is beautifully presented. Improved console horsepower is an obvious factor, but when taken as a whole package, the place is filled with more memorable sights. Many of these, like the Panau Falls Casino and the larger military bases, are well integrated into the story missions, but how about a Mile High Club suspended from balloons? These landmarks give the setting a unique identity, a zany blend of decadence and militarism. The audio also makes a stronger impression. In addition to the memorable main theme you heard at the start of this video, Just Cause 2 boasts a set of tracks that flow organically with the action. As soon as the heat level triggers, the soundtrack enters to match the excess of your chaotic actions. The number of story missions is much lower than the original, but the interludes gradually raise the required chaos threshold. Simultaneously, the enemy resistance also increases. It builds up to the end game, a multi-stage takedown that begins with choosing one faction to support you through to the finish. I went for the Reapers in my playthrough, which doesn't really change anything outside of cutscenes and the aesthetics of soldiers fighting alongside you. A hidden base within a cave is the first target. Set it to explode and Baby P will appear, with some truly stellar voice acting.
It was you, Panay! You who destroyed the only thing I loved. And now that Jade is dead, we'll die together.
Imbecile! Grotesque! I command you to stop! Get that grenade away from me! Throw it away!
After that sublime performance, you'll hop in an agency helicopter and make your way towards a nuclear submarine. Already the scale is trumping the first game as you dodge multiple heat seekers before landing, but it doesn't stop there. If you want to see the leap made in sheer ridiculousness, just compare the two finales. In the original, you took a jet and blew up the missiles. Simple enough, right? By comparison, Just Cause 2 sees you riding on top of the active nukes for the final showdown with a villain who just survived both a grenade explosion and all the rounds you pumped into him earlier. It's the kind of insane scenario that Michael Bay would fall in love with. In a last-minute swerve, Rico redirects the final missile into the oil fields, killing Baby P while preventing a resource war at the same time. As the credits conclude, you're left with a tally of your in-game statistics, one of the clearest signs that Just Cause 2 absolutely nailed both its gameplay loop and design documents. While it didn't achieve the same acclaim as Red Dead Redemption, Mass Effect 2 or Super Mario Galaxy 2, the game was still an incredibly popular release that had now cultivated a fan base. It would exceed sales expectations, reaching over 6 million units sold by 2014. 1 year later, in 2015, the third game in the series would arrive. When the 8th console generation arrived, Avalanche grew massively, establishing a new office in New York and taking on several projects at once. They were also acquired by Square Enix. We had a small-scale hunting title developed in partnership with Expansive Worlds, Rumble City for mobile devices, and Mad Max, an underrated and often overlooked title that released alongside Fury Road. Just Cause 3 was their fourth and final release in 2015, and it ultimately sat right in the middle of its series. While many players consider it their favourite, I believe there are some niggling flaws that hold it back. While I had played brief snippets of Just Cause 3, I didn't get into it fully until this retrospective. The reviews were more mixed for this one, and it was facing some stiffer competition from other AAA releases at the time. Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain delivered an unparalleled level of player creativity in stealth scenarios, and The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt created a powerful story that matched the scale of its setting. Even the likes of Batman Arkham Knight and Assassin's Creed Syndicate had their own offerings to players. Just Cause's size and scale was no longer enough to stay at the head of the open world genre, which had become saturated in the 5-year gap between releases. The game offers many welcome refinements and expands in some smart ways, but it also takes some steps backwards. Dialing back the silliness of its predecessor and refining other elements, Just Cause 3 takes place in Medici, Rico's homeland in the Mediterranean Ocean. General Sebastiano di Ravello has seized power, using the country's supply of energy-rich Bavarium to build up his army. With Tom Sheldon delivering support, our friendly neighbourhood freedom fighter joins up with the rebel forces. Shown clearly in blue outfits, they're led by the tech-savvy Dima and Mario, who delivers some awkward and often forced comic relief. The personal conflict leads the story into fairly standard territory, with a bit of sci-fi hijinks to spice things up. Despite the developer claim that Just Cause 3 would be 70% wacky and 30% serious, what we get is fairly uninspired. Rico himself has mellowed out since Just Cause 2, and his compatriots are classified as a virtuous band of rebels fighting to win their freedom. In a lot of ways, Just Cause 3 goes back to the structure of the first game, while implementing the focus on chaos from the second. Rather than having over 300 individual settlements, we've gone back to the province system, with each location having a specific number of towns to liberate and bases to destroy. The completion rating for each of these has also been condensed to key destruction targets rather than a percentage. This makes the action flow more consistently, as you're no longer scouring bases for every last little trinket. Every object to blow up is marked on the map and visible on the left side of the screen. This includes attacking police stations, blowing up fuel tanks, destroying billboards, tearing down statues, and assassinating propaganda officials and base commanders. Once you clear this list, you'll finish by raising the flag in cities and towns, with some fireworks announcing the people's liberation. Whether it's blowing up military bases or bringing freedom to the populace, these activities are now required to unlock the next story mission, a welcome change. With these refinements made, the minimap is removed, with the Wi-Fi indicator now used to locate audio logs, shrines to light, and other collectibles. Once you liberate a settlement, a set of challenges will be unlocked. These are successful in broadening the side activities and also connect to the refined upgrade system, but they also require a great deal of skill and patience from the player. Wingsuit courses are what you'd expect. Fly through the rings, extra points if you make it through the red ones. Basic shooting ranges and rampage challenges utilise both weapons and vehicles. Racing across land, air and sea returns, and finally bomb challenges task Rico with driving a rigged vehicle to a target and leaping out before detonation. With specific score or time records for each, trial and error is the name of the game here, which makes these challenges a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's very rewarding to make a perfect run and grab all 5 upgrade gears, but on the other, failing and having to wait through multiple loading screens can grow tiresome quickly. When looking at the online trophy list for Just Cause 3, very few players were able to beat these courses perfectly. Most preferred to just blow things up and forget about being precise. The upgrade gears feed into a range of improvements for Rico, from basic shooting to built-in nitrous for vehicles. One mild annoyance is how the game locks off abilities from previous games, like zooming in while aiming. Still, the gameplay rises to the occasion. Rico now carries 3 weapons, a regular firearm, dual-wielding sidearms, and a heavy weapon like a rocket launcher or sniper rifle. The grappling hook has been altered, allowing Rico to zip-kick into enemies bionic commando style. You can still yank enemies off ledges, but you have to attach them to another object first. Once 2 tethers are connected, you can hold down a shoulder button to make objects crash into each other. It's a handy way of taking on both soldiers and targets without using any ammo, but the game's physics can be sluggish at times. Until you upgrade the grappling hook to have 4 tethers with greater strength, this tool, at least in my playthrough, wasn't as useful. The biggest addition Just Cause 3 makes is the wingsuit. As arguably the most extreme sport out there today, this is a great evolution of the franchise's already strong traversal mechanics. Rico can glide around the environments with ease, pulling himself along with the grappling hook, like he can with the parachute. Landing is as simple as holding the air brake towards a flat surface, and if you're hit in mid-air, a simple button push will keep the protagonist airborne. As you make your way through, you'll be treated to basic cutscenes that mostly involve Rico talking with the rebel forces. While he's joined by mercenaries like Annika and Tio along the way, there's very little to get players attached to any of the characters. Just Cause 2 had a trashy narrative, but it was still entertainingly bad. The sequel, in a bid to tell a less over-the-top tale, feels rather pedestrian. It merely blends in with other generic action stories of the time. Rico himself is mostly one note. He wisecracks very frequently as you play through the game, and generally maintains a good-natured persona, someone who wants to see his home freed from oppression. At first, I thought he sounded like a more gravelly version of Ezio Auditore from the Assassin's Creed series, but the voice actor is different. At the very least, these story sequences don't go on for too long, and it's good that the developer kept their screen time to a minimum. Avalanche also kept the chaos total. It doesn't fuel your progress this time, feeling more like a cumulative total of your achievements. The many scenarios seen in Just Cause 2 have been scaled back, but to make up for this, we get a great variety of locations that are fully in tune with the Mediterranean environment. Long beaches, deep coves, and towering mountains, every section of Medici is lush and tropical. The pyrotechnics continue to impress, with electrical generators bursting into detailed sparks as you lay on the damage. You do have access to the entire island, but at the same time there are some limits placed on the player. The villain's super weapons serve as a buffer zone, quickly shooting you out of the sky if you stray too close to them. You'll also need heavier firepower to take on the more challenging sections of the title. The story may be unremarkable, but character models have also taken a step up. The game's tone also translates into the soundtrack. With Rico working mostly for himself and his fellow citizens in Medici, the music features more heroic sounding pieces. These shift into more intense notes as the heat levels ramp up. When you come away from the open world and enter the story missions, this is where things start to get a bit dicey. There are many more objectives, 28 in total, and they often struggle to leverage the game's mechanics or come up with inventive scenarios. One tedious mission involved a drawn-out defense sequence. Simply stand on top of the truck and defend an EMP machine as it gets transported to its destination. There's also a throwaway delivery sequence where you have to drive down the road without spilling any wine, complete with Mario laying on some cringeworthy lines. Add to that allies dying quickly under fire and Rico's tendency to get knocked off vehicles by explosions, and you have a set of main missions that leaves a lot to be desired. Even further down the road, basic wave defenses aren't able to impress, and at other points the game defaults to cutscenes, showing off an extravagant sequence rather than coming up with ways to engage the player. This is where we get into the lesser moments of Just Cause 3. The in-game stats are back, and this time they've been paired with a set of leaderboards. Unfortunately, this is the most pointless component, seemingly a mandated feature from Square Enix to drive player engagement. It's better to switch these off and go for offline mode, as according to the player base, they cause some frame rate problems. This was the most annoying technical issue for me, at least on a base PS4. When the explosions go off, the game often has trouble running smoothly, and when you reach heat level 5, it really starts to strain under the pressure. Very disappointing on a technical level, and to make things worse, I experienced several crashes in my playthrough. Were the development resources stretched thin when Just Cause 3 came out? Did the game need more time for polishing? This dip in performance would ultimately continue into the fourth title. On the whole, there's an overarching inconsistency that hangs over the entire experience. Cutscenes and loading screens continue to interrupt the action when they could have been handled in-game. Rico moves very slowly when standing on top of vehicles and will sometimes get stuck on objects. The melee attack is now a clunky elbow bash, and bugs can trip up the overall experience. While on my way to the Stingray facility, for example, the heat system got stuck in a loop of calling in boats that cycled endlessly. Other methods of transport are, much like other elements, fairly standard. Cars and bikes grip the road tightly, with the camera being a bit too close to the back for my liking, though it does pan outwards when you connect two objects together. Some unwieldy physics can also cause frustration. At a couple of points, my land vehicle decided to fly through the air at inopportune moments, causing quick fail states. Lighter helicopters can be fiddly as well. A simple move of the analog stick will send them swinging from side to side, causing a cheap death or two. Fighter jets fare better, as the developer mapped basic turning to the face buttons and added an intuitive bomb targeting system. You don't need to fly straight towards a satellite to do damage anymore. No matter which vehicle you're driving, their damage resistance has been toned down significantly. Under sustained fire, they'll quickly explode, meaning you'll be relying more on the wingsuits and parachute to get around. When a vehicle is about to give up the ghost, the targeting reticule disappears and flames start to engulf the chassis, letting you know it's time to eject. A new vehicle chopping system also makes an appearance. Driving or transporting each open-world vehicle to a garage will make them available for deployment. In turn, the Rebel drop feature delivers equipment, operating on a cooldown and doing away with the money system entirely. This system is well balanced, as you'll need to resupply on flares to call down new items. On top of all this, Just Cause 3 introduces some destructible elements to the proceedings. You can collapse bridges, watchtowers, and cranes among other objects. It's not as advanced as DICE's Frostbite engine or Volition's Geomod 2.0, but the destruction of objects like these maintains the thrill factor. At the same time, you'll have to be careful, as Rico can often get caught in the blast of a generator or fuel tank. The game isn't realistic by any means, with the protagonist surviving multiple face plants during wingsuit runs, but don't be surprised if you're taken out by some explosive ordnance, or from being left a sitting duck after crashing to the ground. There was even one point where a stray piece of debris caught Rico mid-flight and ended my explosion spree. Moving quickly and staying mobile has never been more important, as the enemies have received some upgrades of their own. Higher ranking soldiers have tougher armour, requiring some extra rounds to put down. In addition, soldiers focus their fire on Rico, both on the ground and in the air. Sometimes the sheer number of enemies blasting you from every direction can become overwhelming, with Just Cause 3 ditching the health bar in favour of regeneration, and offering no kind of personal armour. You'll be gunned down quickly later in the game. The SAM launchers and flat cannons are a big thorn in your side. Trying to aim at them while wingsuiting is risky, as the combined damage of both a missile explosion and the physical impact will wreck you instantly. Hacking or prioritising these emplacements first is a good idea, as the SAMs will target enemy aircraft instead. Luckily, the game's checkpoint system is extremely generous, constantly saving any destruction you cause and restarting you at key points in each mission. You'll also get some assistance from the rebels, who show up in their own transports once you lower base defences. They don't snag too many kills, but they are useful for soaking up some damage as you go about your demolition duties. Once you've liberated provinces and completed enough missions, a final battle will ensue, represented by the dial in the middle of the screen, showing the tug of war between rebels and government forces. The Freedom Fighters launch an assault on one of Di Ravello's superweapons, and on a visual level, the climax is effective as you fly through the levels with the two sides duking it out. Though from a gameplay perspective, there isn't much change. As long as you complete your objectives promptly, the dial won't swing towards the enemy side. It does feel like a missed opportunity, especially with the game's competitors offering more dynamic scenarios. The same is true of the story in its late stages. Tom Sheldon is seen meeting with Di Ravello at one point, and we learn that it was the United States that helped the dictator gain power in the first place. This had some potential to take the story in a more serious direction, but it ends up going nowhere as this plot thread doesn't come up again until the final moments. Admittedly, the destructive gameplay loop does lose some of its luster when you reach the final island as well. With longer travel times and more heavily guarded enemy bases, the pacing can suffer. Just Cause 3 doesn't switch up its scenarios for the final act. Instead, it expands the list of targets you need to destroy. Heading to a military base and seeing all those icons cascade down the screen, it's all very time-consuming and shows the limits of what the franchise built its name on. The game's progress counter speaks for itself. Just Cause 3 is huge in both scale and content. It took me at least 18 hours to play all the way through and explore the activities fully. Trying to get 100% is no easy task. That is, until this absolute madman from down under did it in less than 20 hours. It's too bad then that there's still nothing to unlock at the end of it all. No cheats or modifiers and no unique gear outside of achievements. Instead, it fell to the downloadable content to expand Just Cause 3's offering. When it came to extra content, Avalanche went beyond simple items and put together 3 larger mission packs, falling under the Land, Air and Sea expansion pass. The 3 packs aren't very long, clocking in at about 90 minutes each, but what they bring to the wider package drastically expands your arsenal. I played Sky Fortress early on, as I had heard about the Bavarian wingsuit and its near-infinite usefulness. Rico straps it to his back and takes to the air to assault a flying battleship. Ran by the Eden Corporation, this mechanized monstrosity sends legions of drones and high-tech troopers after you. By adding jump jets and weapons to the existing wingsuit, Just Cause 3 creates its most exhilarating setups yet. Flying around the fortress, dodging missiles, and blasting your way through obstacles is a ton of fun, while also maintaining a level of challenge as you zip about the place. The controls take some getting used to. It's not like Capcom's Dark Void where your mid-air turns are instantaneous. Instead, it's in tune with the existing wingsuit physics. If you fly upwards for too long without boosting, Rico will eventually lose his momentum and start to plummet back down to Earth. When you use the air brake to turn, you'll need to combine this with the jet to get yourself back up to speed and line up your target. Once you have the controls down, Sky Fortress delivers the most enjoyable aspect of Just Cause 3. Avalanche seems to have stumbled across the ideal formula for an Iron Man title. Even without upgrades, flying the Bavarian wingsuit is highly beneficial, but it's not as fast as jets, keeping the two in balance. It became my preferred mode of transport when I ran out of fast travel beacons, as I could easily find all of the settlements and the targets contained within. You can even boost through or blast off from water, making it even more versatile. The Bavarian sea heist came afterwards, and this brings a heavily armoured assault boat and the Stingray Island base. Once you've built the boat and set out to lay siege to the facility, you start to lay on some seriously destructive power. The multi-missile launcher and twin chain guns devastate both enemies and fuel tanks alike. Sure, you may be confined to slimmer corridors in the second stage of the DLC, but your ultimate reward is well worth the effort. The Eden Spark is an absolute beast of a weapon, and once you have it, you're pretty much on easy streak.
Everyone, what's your status?
It takes a brief moment to charge up, but Rico can unleash a devastating laser strike that obliterates everything in its path. You'll make absolute mincemeat of enemy soldiers and clear destruction targets far quicker than you normally would. If it wasn't for the sheer size of Ravello's forces, you could end the game right there. The final DLC pack I got into was the Mech Land Assault, which takes place on an island in the northwest corner of the map. Rico stows away on board a cargo plane and uncovers a plot involving slave labour and mechanised vehicles. The mechs control very well, and at many points I was reminded of the Lost Planet series. Equipped with heavy weapons and an arm to lift and toss objects, they contribute another means of dishing out destruction. What's frustrating about this side campaign is how the game doesn't put enough emphasis on the vehicles at its centre. The pack needed to mix things up, for example, carrying an enemy or item to open a locked facility. The objectives are also highly lackluster. In prison camps, you have to release prisoners, open up the armories, free their ringleader, and then defend against the enemy until the settlement is liberated. When you have to sit around and wait for a bar to fill, that really puts a dampener on the pacing. Still, having the mechs available back in Medici afterwards is a neat bonus. Taking on the toughest bases in the game lays the groundwork for the final set of missions. Rico assaults a massive stronghold guarded by shielded helicopters and a ton of ground defences. After Dima sacrifices herself to destroy the final superweapon, Medici is freed, but Di Ravello escapes off screen, with Rico and company chasing him down. Perhaps if the antagonist had more development and agency, this would have been an impactful final encounter. Instead, the battle sits on the same level as Just Cause 1, with a very basic boss to wrap things up. There's nothing special or different about it, it's just the same heavily armoured transport you encountered in the last few missions. When you do take down the villain's helicopter, Ravello pops out for a final conversation. You can either put a bullet in him or leave the dictator to commit suicide, throwing himself back into the fires he craved so much. Because this is the only time Rico and Sebastio meet face to face, it leaves a rather empty feeling. Even the so-called revelation of Tom Sheldon going behind the protagonist's back doesn't matter much. In the end though, it doesn't dampen the wider experience. Just Cause 3 can be considered the most sprawling and fully featured game in the series, but is it the best? That depends entirely on personal preference and the format you're playing on. Upgrades to design and gameplay are much appreciated, but when it came to both fun and consistency, Just Cause 2 has the slight edge for me. The fourth, and at this point final game in the series, would have the shortest development cycle of 2 years. By the time the late 2010s rolled around, the open world genre had become crowded and saturated to the point of tedium, with many releases now going hand in hand with the much maligned live service model. Avalanche skirted around this market trend, instead continuing where Just Cause 3 left off. Surely with a new game engine and storm systems, the next entry would be a major upgrade. Unfortunately, it wasn't to be. Just Cause 4 was widely viewed as a disappointment on release, and the series is now on ice due to its weaker performance. It seems Avalanche's most prized IP ended up running out of steam. Having played it from start to finish, the decisions made for this game and the overall formula are truly baffling, making it a giant step backwards in almost every way. All the connected elements from Just Cause 2 and 3 have come undone, and we're left with an extremely forgettable entry. Just Cause 4 takes place in Solis, a South American nation that serves the main base of the Black Hand, who appeared briefly in previous games. With a massive weather-controlling superweapon at their disposal, this faction represents the agency's most lucrative defense contract. The group is led by Oscar Espinosa and his right-hand woman Gabriela. Having cut all ties with his former employer, Rico Rodriguez is fighting to rip apart the shadowy organization at its foundation. The game attempts to kick things off with a gloomy atmosphere. Thunderclouds form overhead as our leading man gazes up at the main facility. You'll slingshot your way to the top and head straight into battle. You'll notice the differences in the shooting controls, but it's not too difficult for veterans to jump in. Rico starts to piece his own fighting force together with the help of his comrade Mira, and after getting knocked out of the sky by a thunderstorm, we're treated to something unfortunate, a walking sequence. Already, Just Cause 4 is getting started on the wrong foot. Rendering the protagonist powerless at the game's opening aims to create a darker tone, but instead you're simply heading in a straight line, waiting to get your gear back as you cross a bridge. This is then followed up by the formation of the Army of Chaos, with Rico standing up to the antagonists. This single cutscene in the first act is longer and wordier than anything the franchise had seen, and it sets the stage for the janky experience to come. With mostly blank faces and incredibly weak effects, the Solis Rebellion is established, and it lacks any kind of urgency or tension. The game wants you to care about this group and root for Rico to take down the Black Hand, but there's nothing to get you invested here. This same sense of underwhelming boredom persists through the entire campaign. Excluding the central facility, Solis is fully open, with its 1024 square kilometre size being about the same as Just Cause 2. The kicker is how destruction is no longer your main goal. Instead, you'll be building the Army of Chaos and pushing their front lines across the map. This is accomplished by completing missions or by raising a painfully slow bar in the top right corner to full. After earning a squad, you simply press X to have them move into a new area on the map, unlocking more objectives in the process. It's no different from Infamous nearly a decade earlier, which grayed out map sections automatically after completing side missions. As you make your way across the landscape, random encounters like hijacking a Black Hand official or the occasional skirmish will pop up, but these are mostly distractions from the main missions. Even the rewards you get for pushing the front line forward are pretty insignificant. Having shorter cooldown timers for heavy drops and fast travel doesn't matter much when you have multiple pilots on hand, and when you consider how weak the enemy is, you'll get by without needing specific items most of the time. The missions themselves are bland and uninteresting. What makes things worse is how they endlessly repeat throughout the game. You'll be doing a lot of waiting around as you wait for bars to fill or timers to run out where the enemy decides to call it a day. At other points you'll be driving hackers around and waiting for them to take over a base for you, or freeing prisoners and covering them as they slowly exit a facility. Each one starts with entering a mission area marked by a green globe in the game world. From here it's a case of hacking computers, disarming car bombs by driving into water, or destroying turbines after exposing them with the grappling hook. Occasionally things will be different as Rico and Mira infiltrate an airport or descend into an underground prison to rescue her father. But in the end you'll be thoroughly unimpressed with the generic scenarios on offer. When compared to other open world titles both past and present, this is a woeful approach that turns a once engaging formula into a highly mediocre campaign. The red destruction targets that played such a big role in previous releases are now an afterthought. They don't factor into mission objectives all that often, and destroying them in the open world barely contributes anything to your progress. Striking out in a different direction is something many franchises do, but if it's done poorly, you end up removing much of what made it so engaging. That's exactly what happened to Just Cause 4. When playing, I felt like I was going through the motions and really had the same exhilaration the series once delivered. The gameplay loop remains the same, with some additions to spice up existing systems, most notably the grappling hook. There are now 3 settings which you can customize in the menus. One is the standard tug system from previous games, the second attaches balloons to items, and the third fits rocket boosters. This setup was designed to expand the tool's capabilities while giving the player more options, but what we get is incredibly hackneyed. Early on in the game I noticed a black airship which was clearly a destruction target. With no air vehicles nearby, I thought I'd give the grappling hook balloons a go. Float Rico upwards on a box to hijack the vehicle. That's emergent gameplay in its basic form. Unfortunately, after attaching 4 or 5 balloons, there was no gain in altitude, putting the game's wonky physics on full display. Rockets fly off randomly, grappling hook tethers will fail to pull if placed at the wrong angle, and in other cases you'll need to upgrade each function first to make it viable. As it turned out, there was no need to use these custom options, as the enemies all went down easily with regular weapons. Why would you waste time floating exploding barrels over to the enemy when you can just shoot them instead? Outside of the returning zip kick and platforming options, the grappling hook is now effectively useless in combat. The failure of this gameplay system means the side missions also become redundant. We have 3 defined sets for 3 different characters who are all governed by their own progression bars. The first is Louis Sargento, a simple fellow who wants to rally the citizens and train them to fight. His objectives involve picking up a couple of Army of Chaos soldiers and taking them on a rampage, or covering a squad's advance. Then we have filmmaker Garland King, who gets Rico to perform stunts on camera. This will often involve racing through checkpoints or performing high-flying acrobatics. Finally, there's Javier, an archaeologist with some light puzzle elements. On top of having repetitive objectives, the upgrades they bestow for the grappling hook aren't worth the effort. Giving balloons a stronger pull or the dual hook a more violent tug is no substitute for firearms, and the missions only call for their use in very narrow circumstances. What's also underwhelming is how many components were trimmed or removed. I was already missing the Bavarian wingsuit as the game started, but Rico is now unable to pick up turrets, climb around vehicles, or spin back into a wingsuit flight if he's hit in mid-air. The latter is especially frustrating, as you have to grapple onto a point before re-entering aerial traversal. It puts a big dampener on the pacing as you wait for a target reticule to come in range. Vehicles sit on the same level as Just Cause 3. We do see occasional hiccups in controls, such as tanks having overly sensitive steering, but they get the job done well enough. Many of them now have ammo counters, meaning you'll have to hop out and continue on foot in some cases. The way they're implemented into missions varies greatly. In the case of racing for Garland King, they do offer some speedy thrills, but in other cases the game throws a ludicrous amount of enemies at you. One mission with a heavy use of tanks ends with defending a satellite dish, with the Black Hand vehicles and drones pouring in constantly. Tasks like these are sure to get on your nerves. The one area that has improved is the gunplay. Just Cause 4 ditches the auto-targeting in favour of a basic aim button, and the shooting immediately feels more precise. Headshots are marked by a satisfying pop, and while weapon upgrades are gone, each gun now has an alternate firing mode for some added utility. Grenade launchers, a built-in rocket launcher for the sniper rifle, burst fire for the shotguns, and turning the machine gun into a turret to take up a defensive posture. This adds a much needed rejuvenation to what would otherwise be a basic arsenal. It's just too bad that there's no longer a synergy with traversal. The enemies themselves are also a pushover for the most part. Despite wearing armor and making use of alternate fire options, most of them can be executed with a simple headshot. They'll often throw themselves at Rico and his objective until the mission is complete, so their artificial intelligence is also very lacking. Along the way, the cutscenes and the central story don't get much better. Tom Sheldon's apparent misdeeds are tossed aside early on, and the efforts to integrate Rico's father into the mix don't amount to anything. Just Cause is a series of shallow stories, but they still had entertaining moments on the way through. This narrative feels incredibly bland and lifeless from start to finish. All told, it's a real head-scratcher as to why Just Cause 4 took such a massive step down. Development details are scarce, mostly confined to web updates and video walkthroughs. Did the new game engine cause problems, or was the title rushed to market? I'm leaning towards the latter personally, as some demo shots looked very different from the final product. The marketing for Just Cause 4 placed a hefty emphasis on the storm systems, but they're actually a very small part of the game. Instead of unfolding organically within the world, they're relegated to specific missions. None of them come close to switching up the gameplay or design templates. The first showdown unfolds with a lightning generator placed on a river. After heading there in a boat, you'll rip the device apart piece by piece while avoiding the lightning strikes. It's a passable setup that doesn't differentiate itself from previous games. You'd think that flying directly into a tornado would be an awesome gameplay scenario, but instead you have to take out some wind cannons on the rooftops, then watch Rico destroy the weather platform for you. Easily the most disappointing moment in the entire campaign. The last set piece felt more annoying than anything else. A sandstorm that slows you down and blurs Rico's vision. Following the lights to free generators and blowing them up one by one lacks impact, and by the time you're finished, you'll be glad to have the restrictions lifted. So that's one set piece that relies on destruction somewhat, another condensed to a cutscene, and a third that outstays its welcome with a blurry aesthetic. Aside from the novelty of Rico and air vehicles getting caught up in a tornado that messes with the controls, these artificial disasters don't add anything to the bigger picture. When you destroy each infernal machine, you're given the option to change the weather at will, but this is a novel gimmick and nothing more. Off mission, things aren't much better, as Avalanche overcorrected on Just Cause 3's challenges and went with some shallow elements instead. No matter which stage you're at in the game, the objectives are laughably basic, and their continued repetition across the environment leads me to believe they were rushed in with minimal effort. Drive through a ring with this specific vehicle, wingsuit through these 3 rings before the timer runs out, drive through another ring at high speed. I can see what they were trying to do here. Implement challenges directly into the world to cut down on loading screens and make the action more seamless. While it does succeed at this, these mini moments don't follow through when it comes to depth, falling into the same tick box design of countless contemporaries. In a lot of ways, the DLC eclipses the main game in overall quality, but judging by every PS4 trophy being labelled ultra rare, it seems next to no one bothered with the free packs. The greatest irony is how they leverage the gameplay systems to better effect. The first of these was Daredevils of Destruction. A blend of Twisted Metal and Fallout wasn't something I expected for Just Cause, yet it works incredibly well. Rico stumbles across a trio of criminal gangs with a penchant for vehicle modification and demolition derby. To earn their respect and leave the army of chaos alone, the Solis Underground tasks him with beating a set of challenges, which all involve racking up as many points as possible. Reaching B, A and S ranks rewards you with vehicle upgrades that carry over to the base game. Whether you're driving around an area filled with items to shoot or racing along the cliffs, this DLC has a fun factor and solid aesthetic that the main game lacks. If you lose your vehicle or drive off course, a simple button press will reset you, and on the whole, Daredevils of Destruction is out to give you a rollicking good time with no fuss. It even has a kick-ass soundtrack, with a sweet guitar riff every time you leap through a flaming ring. The vehicles have their ups and downs, with the monster truck faring the worst with its wing cannon, but you'll still get a ton of enjoyment out of it. Los Demonios is the second and weakest offering. Rico and Javier stumble across an ancient ruin off the coast of Solis and inadvertently trigger the release of a demonic swarm. After the first mission, you have 6 infestations to clear out. While the enemy design does show some potential at first, their execution undermines it every time you enter one of the glowing hives. Where the base game was too easy, Los Demonios dumps a near constant barrage of enemies and attacks on Rico. Aerial bombardments, vehicles taken over by plants, and enslaved soldiers using heavy weapons. The result is a highly infuriating slog that grows more tiresome with every infestation you assault. Trying to land hits on weak points while dodging attacks can feel downright impossible, reminding me of the most annoying moments in the Lost Planet series. The best way is to paraglide around the place, but good luck doing that without dying. Dropping in weapons is your only respite, as vehicles are instantly destroyed on entering. The worst moment came at the end, where I killed the final boss, a giant plant, only to be taken down before the final cutscene could play. Very little attention was paid to challenge or fairness here. It all boils down to pure spam until you fight your way through. Danger Rising is the final pack, and it sits somewhere in the middle. The agency decides to terminate Rico and sends an entire fleet of submarines to the island. What's interesting about this DLC is how Avalanche suddenly remembered that Just Cause is a series about destruction. Much like Sky Fortress in Just Cause 3, Danger Rising involves a set of destruction targets that all need to be taken out to destroy the submarine. You'll then do this 5 more times across the map. While it's a shame the targets don't change much for each sub, the gameplay returns to its roots successfully. It involves dumping crates into the sea, vehicle scanning gates, overloading power cores, destroying turrets and power cells, and finally killing Rico's ex-colleagues in firefights. What does save it somewhat is the hoverboard, a new toy with intuitive quick turns and a simple click of the analog stick for deployment. It controls great when you're out in the open and grinding along power lines, but in cramped quarters it can get fiddly. The DLC closes with a possible hint towards the next game, with Maria Kane now fully against Rico. In spite of all the regressions in design and gameplay, Just Cause 4 runs better than its predecessor. I didn't have any hard crashes or stuttering this time around. Solis looks good enough with strong environmental variety, and the storms, despite not contributing to the action, do deliver a unique atmosphere at times. Much like the story, however, the overarching presentation is incredibly muted. The main theme in the soundtrack is quiet and unengaging, and while the action pieces maintain the same style as previous games, they lack the punch to bolster the core action. Like the rest of its uneventful campaign, Just Cause 4 fails to deliver on the climax as well. Driving your way up the mountain for a final assault on the superweapon, there's no sense of build-up or accomplishment. The two villains who we haven't seen through the entire game now suddenly show up for the grand finale. If you were hoping for some kind of apocalyptic, world-ending encounter with the Weather Corps, don't bother. The Black Hand commander abruptly switches sides for no reason, and the guy in the suit is taken out by, you guessed it, a cutscene. It's the worst conclusion in the entire series, as you merely fight your way into the central tower, blow up some turbines, and kill some foot soldiers and helicopters. With Espinosa taken down, the Army of Chaos celebrates their victory, with Rico and company resolving to go after the agency next. With hollow review scores and even hollower commercial performance, Square Enix announced that Just Cause 4 had failed to break even, and Avalanche quickly moved on to other projects. Nearly 4 years and one console generation later, there's no sign of another release in the Just Cause franchise. What started as an open world with a lot of potential has now blended into the background, relying too heavily on the same cookie-cutter design template. The idea that an open world isn't complete without a bloated list of menial, insignificant tasks has become too widespread in recent years. While many big-name releases still sell, there's no doubt that stagnation has set in across the board. With multiple studios opened in the UK and US and 2 subsidiaries under their belt, Avalanche isn't doing too badly, but their overall prominence has faded of late. They did some work on the middling Rage 2, and are currently working on a title called Contraband under Xbox Game Studios. Will Mr. Rodriguez be back for a 5th entry? It's hard to say with such an exhausted and overpopulated genre. Thanks for watching.